All right, the key causes. The first one, alliances, specifically rigid alliances where people got on one side or the other and they weren't flexible. They went to war because they had pinky promised the others that they would, rather than because it was in their direct right. Let's start before World War I and understand that for about 100 years before World War I, there was a period of time, a century, called the Concert of Europe, or the Century of Peace, from 1815 to 1914. In 1815, a very expansionist Napoleon was finally defeated, and France no longer was threatening to take over the entire continent of Europe. As a result, the great powers that had defeated France decided to get together at the Congress of Vienna and discuss how they were going to prevent this sort of continental war from developing in the future. And what they agreed upon was called the Concert of Europe. They decided that they would, if there were any conflicts that would occur between great powers, before they would roll up their tanks on the battlefield and mobilize their troops, they would call a concert, a meeting of the great powers of Europe to discuss how they were going to handle this issue. Now, this is not an idealistic peace, but instead what many call a well-armed peace. They were a bunch of strong-armed states that were able to throw their weight around at a table and kind of bully the others to get in line. But many have described this as a successful way in which to conduct peaceful politics in Europe. And for 100 years, it was relative peace. Now, who were the great powers? The great powers during the Concert of Europe were Russia, Great Britain, France, and we'll call them the Germans, because at this time Germany did not exist, not until the late 1800s. Before that, there were a bunch of independent Germanic states, they were called. The two biggest, Prussia and Austria, and then there were 37 other small states. Okay, Prussia was considered to be the largest, most dominant of the Germanic states, and as we'll see, started to become the central when Germany finally did consolidate all of these Germanic states into one state. It was Prussia that was the leader. One thing that you should understand is that much of the discord in Europe throughout the 20th century, certainly, but also the 19th century, can be understood by looking at France and Germany and the border between them. France and the Germanic states, specifically Prussia, had been long-term rivals. And during the 1800s, you'll start to see that France, as you can see, had expansionist nature, as did Germany. Germany, and specifically Prussia, started to become very militaristic. And as a result, towards the end of 1800s, in 1878, France went to war against the Prussian state. Prussia at this time was a strong military state and did quite well and defeated France, and then decided to take the role as the leader of the Germanic states. And from then on, Germany was consolidated under Prussia's rule. After 1878, there was really kind of a sharks versus jets, or two sides of alliances throughout Europe. And people took their sides and they didn't switch. So the alliances started to become more rigid. On one side we have, and these are a little confusing because the names are quite similar, on one side we have the Triple Alliance in red. On the other side we have the Triple Entente. Let's start with the Triple Alliance. The newly consolidated Germany, with Prussia leading it, was part of the Triple Alliance. And as you can see, Germany and French rivalry, you have the Triple Alliance, Germany at the head. In the Triple Entente, France was on the other side. In addition to Germany, you had Austria-Hungarian Empire. Now, as we mentioned, Austria was a Germanic state, but through many marriages with Hungarian royalty, the empire expanded throughout and into southern and eastern Central Europe. And Austria-Hungarian Empire aligned with Germany. Now, there's a bit of rivalry. Austria really never liked being the second most powerful Germanic state, but ultimately they ended up forming alliances, mostly because they had shared enemies. The third member of the Triple Alliance is actually a funny story. Originally, it was Italy, But as World War II started to draw near and Italy realized it may be embroiled in war that it had no interest in, Italy went and shopped around and decided that the Triple Entente might be a better deal for it, so ultimately left the Triple Alliance. As a result, Germany and Austria-Hungary went to the Ottoman Empire and asked if it would be a part of the Triple Alliance. So the Triple Alliance was actually originally the first two, and then the Ottoman Empire came on towards the beginning of World War I. The Triple Entente. The Triple Entente included France, as we mentioned, a rival to Germany, and quite naturally, if you look at where Germany is located on the map, if you have a French rivalry on one side, France wants to make friends with Russia, the other side, so as to check any sort of rising, strong, powerful Germany in Europe. And then Great Britain. France and Great Britain had gotten along quite well, had agreed to trading routes and treaties for centuries. And so Great Britain really had a strong concern about Germany and Austria-Hungary, as well as the Ottoman Empire, and so aligned on the Triple Entente. So here you have it. On one side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And on the other, in blue, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain. A second reason that many say that World War I occurred is militarism, a general focus in a state on the military, prizing the military, and encouraging increase in investment in military technology and military expertise that almost asks a state to look for a war so as to justify all of this military investment. And more often than not, they chose to join the military. As a result, the Junkers in Germany were kind of had this militaristic view of myths of heroicism, etc., that really kind of caused this culture of militarism. In addition to this, throughout the late 1800s was the Industrial Revolution, and along with the technological advancements in creating goods for people, there also became technological advancements in warfare. New weapon systems, new inventions that helped ships go further. For example, Great Britain and Germany, Great Britain had been the historical naval power, and you see that Germany starts to try to industrialize quickly in order to compete with Great Britain's industry, and in part, once you have the goods, you have to get them to the world. And so Germany decided also wanted to challenge Great Britain's naval power. The invention of the ship of new ships that were able to run on oil versus coal at the time also revolutionized the idea that you can fight a war and you can send your naval ships much farther than you normally could. So militarism is not just simply an appreciation of the military, but a general public opinion and general fervor within a state that encourages the military and prizes the military over other areas of interest. The third cause of World War I is a rise in nationalism. Now, a nation is a group of people that have intentionally found some sort of commonality and perceive each other to be a collective group based on that thing they have in common. The third cause of World War I is nationalism. Now, nationalism, as I mentioned prior, is when a nation really focuses on its own appreciation of its culture, of its linguistic, whatever commonality it finds, and ultimately within nationalism, we see nationalism as a pretty positive connotation, as an assertion of a nation and a nation that wants to rule itself. In Europe, nationalism has a much more negative connotation because it suggests either an exclusion of other nations or an attempt for self-determination, that is, a desire to rule oneself, to have your own state, at the expense of other states' territory. And that's what was occurring during this time. In the 20th century, there was a rise of nationality, a desire for ethnic groups in Europe, specifically in Eastern Europe, to push for statehood, to become a nation with a state, or a nation-state. This is in the midst of large empires, as you can see in the map. Austria-Hungarian Empire was stretched through most of Central Europe at a time where different ethnic groups in the Central and Eastern European area were calling for independence from Austria-Hungarian Empire, as well as the Ottoman Empire in other areas, but specifically Austria-Hungary during this time. You start to see that as Austria-Hungary did very well in expanding its territory, it started to push further south. And within the south, there were several ethnic Slavic groups, including Serbs, that were very concerned that Austria-Hungary would expand into its territory, and understandably so. Years before World War I, and as I mentioned, the Serbian nationalist assassinating Austria-Hungary, Austria-Hungary had expanded south into Bosnia and had taken the territory. And so Serbia was very concerned that its independence would be threatened by a southern moving Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so the Serbs got nervous. And what happened? What happened to poor Franz Ferdinand? Well, Franz Ferdinand was a member of the royal family of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he was actually visiting with his wife Bosnia. He was in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and he had just given a had a public appearance. And he was leaving the public appearance and was shot by a Serbian nationalist. Well, what happened? This is very simply put. But when Serbia when the Serbian nationalists shot the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austro-Hungarian Empire, the empire responded, and they were livid. They gave what was known as the July Ultimatum. This is considered one of the worst diplomatic negotiations ever. The Austro-Hungarian Empire said, "You have two options, Serbia. Either you let us come into your independent state and launch an investigation to find out just who assassinated Franz Ferdinand and whether they have connections to the Serbian government, because there was conspiracy theories that they did, or we will bomb you. So either we're going to breach your sovereignty by coming into your territory and investigating, or launching an investigation for you, or we're going to breach your sovereignty through military conflict." Well, Serbia, a very small, weak country, but very prideful with strong nationalism, stood up to Austro-Hungarian Empire and said, "You will not conduct any investigation in our territory," and as a result, they were bombed. The Austro-Hungarian Empire bombed Serbia, and the next day, Russia began mobilizing troops. Russia had long since been a friend and ally of Serbia. Thus I have Serbia, though they were not a part of the formal Triple Entente, they had really good friends who were a part, and very powerful, great power friends, who were a part of the Triple Entente. Russia had was filled with ethnic Slavs as well, and so had kind of a kindred brotherhood with Serbia, and actually had formed a defense agreement, an informal defense agreement with Serbia years before. So Russia began to mobilize against Austria-Hungary. Because of the Triple Alliance and the rigid alliance that had formed, Germany sees Austro-Hungarian Empire mobilizing, and doesn't like Russia, distrusts Russia anyway, and begins mobilizing against Russia. Well, as a result, France, very concerned about Germany mobilizing ever, and in an alliance with Russia, begins mobilizing, and pretty soon Great Britain is involved as well. Thus, you have what was could have been a small regional war turn into a continental war. All right, for this assignment, 4.1.2, you're going to complete a quiz in which you will be tested on some of the facts I just presented in this video on the causes of World War I.